you guys going to vote with the government so they can get this legislation through?
Well, firstly, Kay, it's good to join you as always. No, we won't be supporting this tomorrow. This is the third change in the law in recent years on immigration. They previous to have not worked. And this particular plan in respect of Rwanda is unworkable and it is astronomically expensive. We're on £290 million at the moment. All the Conservatives seem to have managed to send to Rwanda with 3 of their own Home Secretaries. And rather than continue with this, what is essentially, frankly, a gimmick, it is not going to work. What we need to do is to be putting in that very difficult, painstaking work that we need to prevent people making that perilous journey in those very vulnerable craft across the English Channel. But rather than actually doing the difficult, complex work that is required, this government is far more interested in its own survival. They are not putting the country first. They are putting the survival of their party and the government first.
They're also putting 700 million aside to manage small boats until 2030. If you win the next election, will you scrap that?
Well, that is a cost of failure. That is a cost where they are estimating that the small boats issue is going to continue for many years.
Just answer the question, if you would, please, Mr. Thomas-Symonds.
Well, can I tell you what Labour would do?
No, you can tell me, you can in the fullness of time, but if you could answer that question to start with, please, and that is, would you scrap this £700 million scheme till 2030 if you win the next general election?
We would want to be bringing the number of small boats crossings down so you wouldn't have to spend that amount of money. And the way that we would do that is threefold. Firstly, rather than continuing to spend money on the failing Rwanda scheme, we would use that money. The government got 50 million allocated for the next year to Rwanda on a cross-border policing unit with specialist officers working in the National Crime Agency and indeed across Europe to bust the criminal smuggler gangs. Secondly, get a grip of the asylum system here in the UK with an appropriate number of caseworkers so that the 165,000 backlog is coming down. And thirdly, get the returns agreements in place. And if you were doing those things, Kay, you were doing that work you need to do, you wouldn't need to spend £700 million on small boats arrivals right up to 2030.
So you would scrap it then?
Well, we want to get to a position where we don't have to spend that money. Of course we do. That is a cost of failure. And the government should actually be trying to bring these small boat crossings down rather than throwing good money after bad with the Rwanda scheme.
OK. Talk to me about COVID fraud tip-offs. Apparently 98% of calls are not investigated. COVID fraud cost us a fortune during the pandemic.
Yes, there have been estimates of COVID fraud costing as much as £7 billion or more. And to great fanfare last year, the government set up a COVID fraud hotline. And yet it appears that of all the tip-offs that the government's had about COVID fraud, they have only followed up on 2% of them. Now, that is quite appalling. It speaks to not only the government's incompetence, but it also speaks to the government's profligacy and lack of care with public money. That's why what Labour would be doing is having an actual COVID corruption commissioner that can go after this money and try our best to get taxpayers' money back where it has been misused. This COVID hotline shows that the Conservatives are just not doing that.
What sympathy do you have for Rishi Sunak at the COVID inquiry today? He was doing his best to try and get the hospitality industry back on its feet.
I don't have sympathy because I think the questions the Prime Minister faces today, the difficulties he's facing, are of his own making. So we firstly got the issue where one of the government's scientific advisors used to call him, we're told, Dr. Death Chancellor. So was he reckless with regard to people's lives in the pandemic? Secondly, on Eat Out to Help Out, which you just specifically mentioned, The question is his evidence as compared to that of Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty. Did he ask for, take, listen to the appropriate scientific advice on that scheme? And thirdly, we know that the Chancellor, as he was then, now the Prime Minister, received a fixed penalty notice for breaking the rules. So I'm sure he'll be asked about that as well. But one thing is certain, we can learn more about Rishi Sunak as Chancellor during the pandemic, but I don't think we need any more information to know that the Prime Minister's misjudgments then, misjudgments now, are costing the country dear.
First Cameron, now potentially Boris Johnson back in the government. What would that mean for the next general election?
It would mean that the Conservatives are in a completely desperate situation, that we're even having this discussion where they've had, firstly, a Prime Minister back who was the Prime Minister for the first 6.5 years of this Conservative government, but also that they are going back to another of their former Prime Ministers, disgraced former Prime Ministers, really does show how low the Conservative Party has sunk. And rather than this continued Conservative soap opera where they're putting their own survival as their top priority, it's about time they actually put the country first and gave the British people a say in this merry-go-round of Prime Ministers and Chancellors and had a general election.
How do you feel about politicians being in the jungle?
Well, I've not watched this year's Kay, but I understand that this year, obviously, Nigel Farage came third as Matt Hancock did last year. I guess going to the jungle is a matter for them. I thought it was slightly different in the Matt Hancock case because he was a sitting member of Parliament at the time, but it's up to them what they wish to do on reality TV. But I think the real serious issues are here at home this week and showing the real difficulty now that the government has. This is a government that has run out of ideas, run out of steam, and frankly should soon be out of time.
Oh, I thought you were going to be a bit of a sport there, Mr. Thomas-Symonds, and be a bit funny about it. I mean, at least he had his hot pants on yesterday. Earlier on in the show, we saw his bottom.
I'm relieved to. I'm relieved to hear it's at least been entertaining. I mean, I have watched it in previous years, but just haven't watched it this year as it happens.
Fair enough. Been a bit busy doing other things, potentially running the country come the next election. We'll see. It's good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Good to see you. Bye-bye.